impossible to reduce animal suffering while animals are still regarded as property, or that it is possible to reduce animal suffering now, but it will increase it in the future or via abolition. This may be true, and it will provide you with a good reason for not supporting these measures, but these are empirical claims that abolitionists lack empirical support for. So let's just get to the bottom of this. Let's continue commissioning empirical studies to support these claims. I think these should be welcomed by both abolitionists and welfarists. Until we do so, we're moving in the realm of mere speculation, and while speculation makes for interesting philosophical discussions, it does nothing for the animals themselves, and I think we owe them more than this. So, thank you very much. I am ready to be destroyed, either now or... That was my plan from the get-go.
Yeah. What we're going to do, we're running a little late, and I want to keep us on as much on track as we can, because what happens is at a particular time, in Newark on a weekend, they lock the building, and I'm only kidding, I don't know why. I mean, people have to get out to get the planes and stuff. So what I want to do is, let's take stay in your seat if you can. If you have to go to the restroom, or you need coffee, or whatever, whatever you want to do. But do it quickly, and let's try to come back in 5 minutes. And then we've got David Nyberg, Professor Nyberg, and I think you're going to find that really an intriguing talk. Then we've got our panel discussion, and so let's try to keep it moving. Okay, thank you.
Well, hold on now. I think what I like, to be fair, around the average. Yeah, that's why it isn't necessarily the thing why C&C was not so the
First of all, there are several arguments.
I was going to say, like, I was wondering how you felt about linearity. So let's say, because, you know, I think it's difficult because there are some ways that I have more there are many ways to do it. So our analogy will be complicated because that opens us up to saying, if it suits my purposes, I don't think that's big. But I think assuming there's no you're really ready to serve second let's say you run an organization children for the rest of the night. Yes, very happy. You give them water and food and they just happen to be good at making slavery. And so there's something wrong with them making some stuff and you selling that stuff. I think a little confused. You got gas at Times Square on school day, and I'm like, why is this school? How is this school? Just, you've seen it, right? Yeah. Just like, I recorded from it perhaps wrongly. I could be wrong. Something there.
Because they fall off, like after that.
Small bottles, okay?
Sorry?
Small or big bottles?
Big ones if you've got them. In large crystal goblets. Yeah, we're just waiting for Tim to bring the water back so that David can start, and then we'll just go right into the panel discussion. Are you all having a good time?
Yes.
I hope Where's Louis? Did he come back? There he is. I thought if you didn't come back, people are going to think you mysteriously disappeared, and they were going to think it was sort of a non-violent, violent thing. And he's in good shape. He's all right. You can see he's fine. I'm just sort of curious. How many of y'all are vegan? Just curious. Okay. Okay. This is the revolution, people. This is the revolution. One of my favorite students. Is that way to becoming vegan? Not yet. Thank you. 1 month. 1 month. Okay. Stick around. I can only go ahead and all right. Our last speaker this afternoon is David Nyberg, who is actually, I read a book of his years ago, Animal Rights and Human Rights, The Entanglements of Repression and Liberation. What I loved about it was, although I didn't agree with certain things he said in it, he was trying to make the human rights, animal rights connection, which has been woefully absent from the animal movement. And the animal movement, at least at the level of large organizations, tends to be focused on animals, and indeed, to the extent that humans are involved, it's in a problematic way. For example, I think the sexism in the movement, particularly with the PETA campaigns, is horrible. But that basically these are not ideologically progressive organizations. These organizations are basically, they're charities. And David's book really, boom, it was terrific. And it really made a lot of the connections. It was also really nicely written. And when Gary Steiner and I got our series at Columbia University Press, I really wanted something from David. And he's got a new book in our series, Domesticration, and in which he's going to, I assume that's what you're going to talk about today? I mean, basically the thesis of that book?
Not really.
He's got a really interesting book out in Columbia that he's not going to talk about today, and then he's instead going to talk about something else. But he is, and maybe that'll be the next book that we will want to put in the series. But he is a professor of sociology, and he teaches animals and society, global change, social stratification, minority groups in law and society at Wittenberg University. And we're really happy to have him here today, irrespective of what he's going to talk about. Anyway, welcome, David Nyberg.
Good afternoon. About 10 years ago, I had a sabbatical year. And I decided to sit in on the meetings of, well, maybe I should tell you what I'm talking about first. First, just to let you know where I'm going, I just wanted to cover 3 points. So I'm not going to talk so much about domestication as I'm going to talk about welfare regulations. Then I'll talk about Will and Sue's book, and a little bit of domestication will slip in there. And then I want to talk about the prospects for abolishing the oppression of other animals within the capital system. So, So 10 years ago, I had a sabbatical year, and I sat in on the meetings of the Animal Care and Use Committee at the large state university in Ohio. And I knew going into it what I was getting into, because I knew the Animal Care and Use Committee was stipulated by the Animal Welfare Act that there had to be a committee to review the research proposals of vivisection that's coming in, to make sure that they're complying with the regulations of the Act. And of course, the Act was put together, although it was promoted by activists. The industries that oppress other animals, I mean, they saw an opportunity here to do something for themselves. So they were involved in crafting that legislation to where it completely met their needs. And then they created these animal care and use committees. Now, I don't know if you know anything about them or sat in on one of those committees, but they're completely stacked by vivisectionists. So at universities like my university, I would never be allowed to sit on that committee. I don't think I would. I think it would be morally problematic, only if I could just go in and basically try to stop everything that they were doing and expose it. But anyway, I sat in that committee for 9 months, and there wasn't a piece of proposed research that was too shallow, repetitive, gratuitous, or horrific that I could approve. It was harrowing. And the only thing the committee did was to help the vivisectionists dot the I's and cross the T's so that the paperwork all looked good. So after 9 months, I wrote an op-ed, and it was published in a couple of newspapers in Ohio. So for at least a day, the vivisectionists, at least one day, they were put under a microscope. But then that was it. And then nothing changed. And I think there's no substantive changes under such welfarist legislation. In Ohio and around the country, animals are going into labs in increasing numbers. And I think this is predictable when put in the context of a critical look at the capitalist state from a critical sociological theory. So from a critical sociological perspective, the capitalist state serves two basic functions. First and foremost, to support capital accumulation. And secondly, to support system legitimation and social stability, or at least enough social stability that capital accumulation can still take place. So in this context, the Animal Welfare Act actually serves, I think, important system legitimation functions, as well as some diversionary functions. That it gives the impression to the public that animals going into laboratories they're going to be treated with care, right? So let the research continue, because they're looking out for them. They've got Animal Welfare Act, they've got IACOs, they'll be fine. So, but it also, I think, serves diversionary functions. And that is that by pursuing such acts, I think people who care for other animals spend so much time, trying to push through yet another piece of reform that ends up being tepid and industry controlled. And then, secondly, they engage in all these quixotic efforts to try to enforce these pieces of legislation. So, nothing really is gained. So by way of another example, it was back in the 1950s that activists were trying to bring more humane slaughter methods to slaughterhouses. And actually back in 1956, there were Senate hearings, and Hubert Humphrey, anybody here remember Hubert Humphrey? Hubert Humphrey actually chaired those Senate meetings, and he opened the hearings by assuring the public that the Senate would not turn a blind eye to suffering and cruelty. So the hearings opened with a flourish, but of course, industry again saw an opportunity. In this case, for both capital accumulation and system legitimation. they realized, I think as Gary said earlier, that it was in their interest to come up with some more efficient way of killing other animals. So, and even if this cost them a little bit more, they would recoup that because smaller slaughterhouse industries or businesses, they wouldn't be able to make these changes. So the large industries saw this as an economic opportunity. And again, it also serves system legitimation, and that people thought, well, animals are going to be treated humanely on their way to slaughter. So slaughterhouses, starting in the 1970s and into the 1980s, again trying to accumulate more capital, they moved from cities like Chicago and relocate in Iowa, where they can get away from troublesome unionized employees, and they can exploit a very vulnerable workforce. And more animals are coming in now because of factory farming, and the lines are moving very quickly. And if you look through newspapers, or like the Washington Post even did a series about the horrific treatment of other animals. ICE, this came out with your book, Slaughterhouse. The enforcement has always been nominal. So, and of course what's happening with other animals is unspeakable. But they've gotten into a bit of trouble because of these young activists coming in with video cameras. And the activists are essentially shedding some of what's light to what's going on to some people. So there have been some changes. So there have been these tepid laws to try to create larger cages or larger confinements. And then, of course, there's people who are more socially conscious. They've essentially, started looking for local organic fare. They also heard about the animals being plied with antibiotics and hormones, and so they wanted to feed their families something safer. So I think coming back to Upton Sinclair that Gary mentioned earlier, I think if Upton Sinclair were around today, that he would find this probably somewhat familiar, because as Gary mentioned, back in 1906 when he wrote his book, he talked about this awful exploitation of workers and this horrific treatment of animals. And he talked about how it all took place within the context of these filthy, unsanitary conditions. And the ultimate consequence of his book was the public wasn't moved by the horrific treatment of animals or the exploited labor. It was partly feeding their families. So it led to the creation of the Animal Welfare Act. So Upton Sinclair essentially lamented later on, and he said that he was aiming for the public's heart and he hit their stomach. And it seems to me that what animal welfare organizations today are doing is basically the same. I think they're intending to hit the public in the heart, but they're largely hitting them in the stomach. I think the socially conscious are consuming their local, organic, humanely raised fare. I think while the masses continue to consume the cheapest fare that the animal industrial complex can muster. So these welfare reforms, again, are tepid. They serve industry reforms, but welfarists also take the position that, well, this is going to take time, and this is a gradualist movement, and this is evolutionary. So I want to do a brief digression that I'll come back to later, but I just want to look at efforts to ameliorate human suffering and look at those reforms and what's happened to them. So back in the 19th century, they had trouble raising revenues for public projects, so they turned to privately run lotteries, and then the companies would give the money, part of the money, to the state. There were critics at the time that said, this is a terrible way to raise money. You're preying upon the poor. It's immoral and sinful. But that criticism did not get traction. Not until about 1890, when financial institutions were more developed, and then they said, okay, we're going to ban lotteries. So President Benjamin Harrison stood up and said, lotteries debauch and defraud the people of the United States. So Congress passed an act that essentially shut them down. But then we fast forward to the 1970s, and we're in the time of capital flight and deindustrialization, and states are losing money. What about lotteries, right? Critics rise up and say they're immoral, sinful, they prey upon the poor. But the states needed the money. So state after state, right? Lotteries came back. By way of another example, the New Deal reforms, the 1930s, capitalism was about to collapse. And the New Deal reforms helped to keep capitalism on its feet at least until World War II. It's always a war that's really powers the capitalist system. But they came up with the Revenue Act of 1932, which established a progressive tax, the Wagner Act, which is basically Bill of Rights for labor, Social Security. Then we go, let's fast forward then to the 1980s and the Reagan administration. Again, capital flight, deindustrialization. So now we see a concerted attack on this New Deal reforms. So we see Reagan going after the progressive tax, and we've seen attacks on that tax, to this day. Tax on organized labor. Business actually back in 1946 got reorganized and came back with the Taft-Hartley Act. It basically undermined a lot of the strength of organized labor. But then Ronald Reagan went after labor unions. And Ronald Reagan cut hard-fought social programs, housing programs, community block grant programs, all under the under his little saying of he's going to get government off people's backs. So basically, we begin to see this shift in wealth from, increasingly, to what is to become the 1%. So then we go to Bill Clinton, right? Bill Clinton hoping change, but Bill Clinton comes in, deregulates, right, financial institutions. He deregulates telecommunications while, going after, the marginalized and exploited people in society. So, Social Security still stands, but I'll bet everyone here a cup of free trade coffee that you're going to see. You're going to see more attempts to privatize Social Security. So anyway, I guess I'm trying to suggest here that that this notion that welfarism, this evolutionary gradualist movement, I think is ill-founded. So I wasn't surprised, and probably you weren't either, when they were working on this new 2014 Farm Bill, this representative from Iowa, Stephen King, he wanted to insert this amendment that would essentially nullify, these welfarist pieces of reform, throughout the United States. So they could have been gone like that. However, cooler heads prevailed, because I think other people realize, these are serving our interest, right? This is important ideological cover for what we're doing. It's providing diversionary functions, and we're not losing any money, so let's keep these in place. And I hope I'm wrong on this, but as climate change advances, and we see perhaps food shortages in the United States and rising food prices, I think that you could see these welfarist reforms go the way of the Lottery Act. I think they go very quickly. So essentially, welfare regulations under capitalism, tepid, weak, they serve the interest of the industries that oppress other animals. And I believe that they simply promote continued animal oppression by making people feel comfortable about it. Okay, turning to Will and Sue's book. My thinking on the issues of animal rights and abolitionism was advanced by reading this book, and I especially liked these concepts of our relational responsibilities with other animals, and the need to start thinking about positive rights. I think it's a very important contribution. there's a few things I didn't agree with I want to talk about briefly. And I'd like to talk to Will and Sue about it. Actually, I wish they were my neighbors. And I think, first of all, they wouldn't be barbecuing. You know. But anyway, I wanted to share a couple of my thoughts. Come back to something, a point that Gary was making, in that, you know, why doesn't animal rights have more social or political traction? And Bill and Sue suggest that, you know, there's, in part of this is deficiency in animal rights theory, especially all this emphasis on negative rights, and we're not showing people, you know, what the world could be like if we would change our relationships with other animals. But I guess I believe that we don't really see social or political traction because of considerable social engineering. I think you know, we've been programmed, you know, for a long time not to care about other animals. So again, a brief digression that I'll come back to. You know, in the beginning of the 20th century, when all of these harms were being created by capitalism, and people like Upton Sinclair were writing these novels and books, and people were clamoring for a different system, the rising capitalist elite and robber barons knew that they had to become the captains of consciousness, and they realized that they needed to control what people were thinking. They needed to put down this challenge to capitalism, and of course one of the ways that they did this was by promoting social Darwinism. So of course social Darwinism was this thought that all of these poor people and all this social misery, this is due to these people who have cognitive deficiencies. All of these people coming in from Southern Europe, all of these people of color, right? This is why we're having these problems, not because of capitalism. And the government should not be creating any programs to support or perpetuate the existence, you know, of these people that have these problems. And so that was really a really nefarious ideology to be promoted. At the same time they were doing that, they were going after leftists, they were going after socialists, and they were going after labor unions, and they were being vilified both in the mass media as well as, you know, they were repressed in such police activities as the Palmer raids, I think in the 1920s and 1919 and 1920 perhaps. At the same time, they were appropriating mass media. When the radio first came along, they quickly saw how that could be used to their advantage, and the same with TV. And then we have people coming along like Edward Bernays, the public relations field surfaces, and Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he was very skillful at manipulating the public, and he did everything from increased public consumption of products derived from repressed animals to getting public support and acquiescence to U.S. imperialist activities in Central America and other parts of the world. So during this period, the sociologist C. Wright Mills said that the public was actually being transformed into a mass. And more recently, social scientists have said citizens, you know, we're not raised to be citizens anymore, we're raised to be consumers. So I spotted this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. Can you read that? Is it too light?
Want me to darken it? You want me to darken it?
Yeah, that might help.
Let's see if I can do this. You may never see light again. Is that okay?
I want to take a second and let you read that, because I think this is powerful. So in 1953, Du Bois was talking about throttling of democracy over 60 years ago, and imagine what he would say today. So the social engineering continues, right? We've all, you know, been inundated with these ubiquitous ads exhorting us to consume increasing levels of other animals as food. At the the same time, we've been manipulated in supporting wars, everything from Vietnam, and again, in part, government lies about the causes of the war, the necessity for the action. Everything from Vietnam to the invasion of Panama to the recent invasion of Iraq. They generated and socially engineered considerable public support. And then to show the power of these captains of consciousness, when the nation and every state runs into economic problems, as opposed to saying we need to look at the machinations on Wall Street and we need to look at all of these tax cuts, you know, this attack on progressive taxes, continual tax cuts, and we need to look at these imperialist invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. In states like Wisconsin and Ohio, they're convincing the public that they're having problems because of teachers and firefighters. And they've got these pensions, right, that are out of control, and they've got collective bargaining. And this is why we're having these problems, right? Pay no attention to all those rich people behind the curtain, you know, at Wall Street and in the Pentagon. So I guess I would suggest that animal rights doesn't really have social and political traction, not because of theory itself. Actually, the students that come into my classes every year, they don't know much about animal rights theory. They don't know much about animal welfare theory. They don't know there's a difference between them. And I think that's generally true of people around the country. So not only do they not know much about animal rights theory, but you know, what they do know about animal rights activists, I think, increasingly is that, you know, they're extremists and perhaps terrorists. So again, all of this is due to hegemonic control of the mass media and powerful social engineering. So I like Will and Sue's concept very much of positive rights. But again, I think how possible would it be to pursue positive rights for other animals under capitalism? And I look, for example, at the efforts to pursue positive rights for people with disabilities. Now we go back to social Darwinism when all of the ills in society were placed upon people with cognitive deficiencies. So this is a real mark of disgrace, you know, for people who did have developmental disabilities. And they suffered tremendous, they were stigmatized, they were institutionalized, subjected to horrific abuse. I think even in the 1950s, they were research subjects, right? They were used for radiation experiments. So when some of this came to light in the 1970s, there was legislation to promote their interests, including some positive rights, that they should have individual education plans. And there was more legislation to protect institutionalized persons in 1980. But then, when I was in Ohio in the mid-80s, huge expose in the Cleveland Plain Dealer about all of this physical and sexual assault and murder and occurring in state institutions. And similar exposés were coming up around the country. And there were Senate hearings, in this case, you know, chaired by Lowell Weicker. So I just wanted to share, you know, a comment that appeared in his report. Protection for the frailest exists largely on paper. And here we have the U.S. Justice Department and Health and Human Services, you know, not enforcing the law. I think in part because the funding wasn't there to enforce the law, and also because of this continued prejudice and discrimination against people with disabilities. So it seems like this act is somewhat similar to the Animal Welfare Act and the Animal Humane Act, and that it largely provides some ideological cover. And if you drive by an institution for people with disabilities, I mean, it looks like, you know, a nice elite university campus, but you should go into one or two of those buildings and you're going to see a very different situation. So widespread culture and devaluation of people with disabilities, it continues, especially in comedy. You know, if somebody wants to get a laugh, you call somebody an imbecile or a moron, or you call them stupid. That basically you're implying that they're slow-witted, right? And so you can laugh at their expense or even slap them or physically abuse them some way. I mean, that remains, you'll see that in, just turn on the TV tonight and you may see more than one examples of that. Even organizations that have been advocating for people with disabilities for a long time are saying the laws are limited, they're not enforced, the funding's not there, and prejudice and discrimination continues. So I'm thinking this is the best that we can do in the 21st century, for people with disabilities. I mean, if you look at the New York Times just within the past few years, I think most recently, August of 2013, have you seen these stories in the Times about the treatment of people with disabilities in state-operated group homes? I mean, horrific abuse and violence, and some people not even getting medication. So, positive rights, it's a great idea, but under capitalism. Okay, but I guess what if Will and Sue and I got into a protracted discussion, it would probably be around this idea of other animals as citizens. That, and I think I've interpreted their writing correctly, is that they're best treated as citizens who, like humans, should be subjected to basic socialization and social control. And I guess when I first read that, I sat back a bit because I thought, what I think they need is less control, perhaps more self-determination. But then they said, they have an obligation and a right to make a contribution to the social good. And this, in some cases, may be that if there are body hair of sheep or some eggs, that perhaps people could use those and maybe even offer them for sale to meet the needs of these new citizens. But then they say we'd have to ensure that there were mechanisms in place to regulate this commercial commerce or this commercial activity. And I thought, now surely what they're talking about is a world away from what's happening today. And actually, wouldn't it be something if we lived in a society where what they're describing could actually take place? But this troubled me a bit because I thought this appears to be, perhaps to be a new form of welfarism that we have if we're going to continue to use other animals and then to create regulations to monitor that use. So, but this is a passage, I think, Will and Sue, that set me back the most. So it's hard to imagine anyone having cow companions except for the pleasure of their company or because they're prepared to go to great lengths for a bit of dairy. This does not mean that there'll be no cows, just not very many. There will always be people who want to have cow companions or pig companions, but the reality is that since these animals are less useful under non-exploited conditions, fewer of them would be brought to the human-animal community. On the other hand, cautious commercialization of the use of cow's milk would lead to it becoming a luxury good, resulting in limited but stable cow community. So I guess when I read this, I thought, so a cow wouldn't be property. So would a cow be a family member? Would a cow be adopted? But then would be what type of companion? But then would people be seeking the companions because they wanted dairy or because they wanted eggs? So then I just worried that any continued use of other animals, may result in this such bringing them into existence because of their use value. So I guess from where I stand, considering that other animals have been subjected to such horrific abuse and violence for over 10,000 years by the tens of billions, that for me it's disturbing to envision a world where they're recorded rights but still considered acceptable to use their hair or eggs or their milk. And moreover, we're trying to convince everyone in the United States, and we ought to be trying to convince everyone around the world, to become abolitionists. How can we convince everybody to do that when some may still be consuming animal products, especially the more affluent that they become luxury goods? I think that's very problematic. So I guess I think that to truly promote abolition of the oppression of other animals, I think use of them in any way like this at all should be seen as morally reprehensible, right? This is just off the table, and we should begin to cultivate those values if the Supreme Court made that decision tomorrow, which I don't think that the Supreme Court is going to make that decision tomorrow. I don't think we're going to see this happen under the capitalist system. But anyway, just I digress. But anyway, to come back, so Will and Sue suggested that they would have rights and obligations, and they should be, maybe they need to support themselves in some way. But again, I think considering everything that they've been through and tens of billions will have to go through, if we ever get to this point, I think they should be given reparations, and they shouldn't have to give anything. But anyway, I still am drawn to this idea of Will and Sue. So I'm thinking, so maybe we can envision a different type of citizenship. So the night before I left to come to the conference, I thought I'd just play with this idea for a minute. I thought, well, maybe we can make them citizens emeritus, right? So they didn't have obligations, to have to commit to society, but they would be free from any material use, right? They'd have positive rights to lands and support systems, and their interests in welfare would be strongly promoted, much in the way I think that Will and Sue suggested that they could be represented. But in the extent of their relationships with the humans would be self-determined. So, we could have another conference and plot out what that might look like. But I guess in the last analysis, I like the idea of citizenship, but I think any continued use, I think, would be very problematic. But otherwise, wouldn't that be an incredible world? Okay, finally, abolitionism. I guess it's in Will and Sue's book, but not just their book. I think in most animal rights literature, capitalism gets a free pass. And I was a leftist before I became an animal rights activist. And when I became an animal rights activist, my leftist friends didn't like me anymore. And a lot of folks on the animal rights movement, they don't like me because I'm a leftist. So, but anyway, so you have to consider, is abolition and justice for other animals really possible under capitalism? So I've already talked briefly about how hegemonic control of the state and mass media is basically the democracy has been undermined substantially. People's view of the world is largely socially engineered. So those are major obstacles toward developing an animal rights agenda, much less rights for members of our species. But I think another obstacle has to do with this idea created by Maslow, and that is he basically suggested, as you probably know, that people have these basic needs, and if they have their basic physiological needs met, then they're able to grow and self-actualize and become better citizens. So that is, if they're more economically secure, they become more tolerant and they're more open-minded. But conversely, people who are insecure and fearful, they become intolerant. They go into like this survival mode status. So I guess I think as long as humans experience insecurity, it's going to be a hard road to try to get justice for any of the oppressed. So with that in mind, just to take a minute to look where we're going, again, people in the United States and around the world are experiencing growing insecurity. So here we've had the New Deal reforms and modest welfare state programs undermined, right, because that facilitates capital accumulation. The ability of people to rise up and get what they want, which is national health care, and they like to see a more just system, and they like to see more protection of the environment. All of these things are undermined by plutocratic control of the government. Capitalists of consciousness are exercising increasing control, and then to come back to think about the boy, after decades of throttling, democracy is not in very good shape. And it's being undermined at this moment by people like the Koch brothers, by the American Legislative Exchange Commission. It's basically probably at this moment drafting further legislation to undermine the environment and social justice. We've got the the Citizens United decision that allowed all of this money into politics, and then the other decision last week by the Supreme Court, that opens the door even more. You've got gerrymandering after the 2010 census in the state of Ohio, where there's a Republican Congress, a Republican House and Senate and governor. The Republicans are going to be controlling Ohio for a long time, and it doesn't bode well, I think, for the next presidential election when you've got a state like Ohio being a swing state. And then this attack on voting rights, for example. So anyway, we are not going in a direction that is fostering security, justice. We're moving in the opposite direction. So again, in that context, how do we promote justice for other animals when, according to Maslow's theory, people are going to have to feel secure and not very fearful, to start becoming good citizens and to start becoming compassionate, and we're moving in the other direction. So again, there's all kinds of reports, and this is just to give you a glimpse of the recent Oxfam report, that notes the growing inequality around the world and in the United States. And the statistic that made the headlines was the fact that 85 individuals now control the same amount as wealth as half the people on the planet. 85 people controlling as much wealth as 3.5 billion people. So of course you're going to have poverty in the United States when that 1% controls so much. We don't have poverty because we have people who are lazy or inherently well. We have poverty because the distribution of income and wealth, we've got such great disparities. How can you not have poverty? And it's getting worse. So how are we going to make progress? Not just for animal rights, but for all of these forms of injustice. Especially noting that all of these forms of injustice are deeply entangled. And both of my books, including Domestic Creation, talk about domestic creation.
Please.
Is talking about this deeply entangled oppression that continues to this day. So while corporations plunder the earth, billions of insecure people will do whatever or eat whoever they can to survive. So, and then on top of all of this, and you may know this already, but to compound this situation is that agribusiness and the retail food industry are planning to double the consumption of animal products by mid-century. To double it. And of course, this is legitimated somewhat by welfare reforms and this movement. If you've got socially conscious, aware, somewhat affluent, educated people in the United States continuing to consume animal products, but they're just getting their local organic stuff. Now, while the masses are eating the cheapest fare the animal industrial complex can come up with, and this is going around the world. So if we don't have the educated, socially conscious standing up saying, this is unsustainable, this is unjust, and we need to stop. So I actually think, again, coming back to this idea of how these welfare reforms are essentially promoting animal oppression. I believe that they are supporting this massive increase, and it's happening. It's happening every year you can look, and it's growing, especially in countries like China and India. And of course, to that end, these vital resources, fresh water, only 2.5% of all the water on the planet is fresh water, and it's being massively squandered, going toward trying to raise these, 65 billion animals, I think, today, and it's growing. Vital topsoil. In Ohio, you drive through Ohio and you see all this corn and soy. It's everywhere. And they have to put down all of these fertilizers, petrochemicals, to keep that stuff growing, because the topsoil is essentially worn out. And then, of course, dwindling fossil fuels, all important, for supporting a planet that is racing toward 10 billion people, 10 billion hungry people on the planet, when 70% of all the world's agricultural land is being used to create domesticated animals for the corn and soy, alfalfa needed to raise them. 10 billion people. And of course, two scientists with the World Bank about 2 years ago came up with a report in which they suggested that raising other animals for food could be responsible for as much as 51% of global greenhouse gases. If you didn't see that report, send me an email. And it was talked about in the New York Times. So now we have all of this going on, plundering vital resources. This drastic increase in other animals as food. And then we have global warming coming in, and of course we know what the consequence is going to be, right? All this disastrous weather. We know, amongst other things, food shortages. Didn't the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just within the last week come out saying we're going to see quicker than we thought? Anybody notice that? More global insecurity. Food shortages. Anyway, their reports are getting more and more alarmist. And then, of course, on top of all this, as this is not news to the Pentagon and the CIA or intelligence agencies in Western Europe or Australia. They're all planning, for this future where there's going to be a struggle over resources. There's going to be desperate people engaging in migrations, trying to seek food and water. We've already seen what the U.S. will do to acquire a steady supply of oil, right? We saw that with that horrific invasion of Iraq. So on top of all of this growing insecurity, countries like the United States, they're making military plans, trying to deal with this bleak future. So again, people need to feel secure to become good global citizens, and we're heading toward a future in which that's becoming all but impossible. So again, basically to sum up, capitalism, destructive, unsustainable, mass media has been commandeered, and the state to promote the conditions favorable to the continued expansion of capitalism. I think animal rights activists, you need to realize that justice for humans and other animals is deeply connected, and that we need to join hands with the left. And I think the left would be more likely to join hands with us if they realized that we were becoming critics of capitalism. There's nothing sacred about the capitalist system. Yet I think it's a destructive, unsustainable system. And I think if we really want to work to end oppression of other animals and all oppressed groups, we need to work to realize and then to work on transcending the capitalist system. So to that end, I suggest that everyone who's concerned with abolishing the oppression of other animals and all forms of oppression, begin to learn about and embrace democratic socialism. Because I think it is under a democratic social system that we have true political and economic democracy, not ruled by corporations. We'd have the human economic security that we need to get people to become intolerant global citizens. We'd have publicly controlled education system and mass media in which we could genuinely do public education, and people, like the ideas you've heard in this conference, could be disseminated nationally and globally. And that is the necessary precondition, in my estimation, to achieve the abolition of the oppression of other animals and all oppressed groups. It's not enough. We have to fight animal oppression. Now we have to fight the capitalist system. So it's not, obviously, a very difficult road. It may be one of the most enormous challenges that's ever faced our species. But I would suggest to you it's the only true path to the end of oppression. Thanks.
Actually, after that discussion, we've set up the student study rooms for those of you who want to take a lethal injection. But why don't we all sit down? Come on, speakers, come on up. Come on up. We'll start there. And then All right, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask everybody, all of the speakers, to come up and give a summation and points of no more than 2 minutes. So if you do less than 2 minutes, you won't be penalized. We'll love you even more. And then we'll go into a question and answer period with the audience. So let's start with Jerry Steiner, who was first. We're going to go in the order of our speakers. Sorry, Ian.
In the final chapter of Animals and Limits of Postmodernism, which is entitled Cosmopolitanism and Veganism, I address a certain feature of the historical ideology that we've all inherited in this culture, and that is the endeavor to provide what in the book I call a transcendental deduction of animals as food. And it seems to me that any really robust sense of justice for animals demands a complete repudiation of that ideology of trying to provide a deduction of animals as food. For me, that makes the question of whether it makes sense to support animal welfare measures very simple. I don't think it depends on a single empirical question. I can give you, I'm not a utilitarian, I think utilitarian is a fundamentally flawed moral theory, but I give you a very straightforward utilitarian reason not to support welfare measures. Every single minute and every ounce of energy that you spend supporting welfare measures is a minute and an ounce of energy you're not devoting to trying to end the systematic exploitation of animals.
So Sue has delegated to me the task of talking for both of us. So I just want to make clear, I hope it was already, that we entirely agree with Gary and Anna and others on the fundamental commitment to negative rights. We have no right to experiment on animals or to kill them or to put them in circuses or zoos or whatever. So the real disagreement is about domesticated animals and what we imagine happens with domesticated animals the day after. And there were a number of different arguments. I just want to distinguish different arguments that came out for why we should be skeptical of the idea of justice, citizenship for domesticated animals. One was the idea that it's simply unnatural for any animals to be part of a human social project. So we completely reject that idea. A second argument was that because domesticated animals have been bred to be dependent and vulnerable, that makes them incapable of having a dignified life, because dependency and vulnerability are somehow intrinsically undignified conditions to be in. And we completely reject that argument, because we think that's pernicious not just about animals, but about humans, because lots of humans are dependent and vulnerable, and that doesn't mean they're incapable of having dignified and flourishing lives. A third argument is that some animals, some domesticated animals, have been bred in such a way that they live lives of physical torture. Right? So Anna gave this example of pigs, that because of the way they've been bred, if they're not killed at a certain point, their lives become physically unbearable. Okay, so we completely agree with that. If that's the circumstance that would be applied to some domesticated animals, that their lives become not worth living because of physical, the way they've been bred, that they can't stand up, they can't breathe, of course, then that's the grounds for selective extinction. But we would argue that does not apply to the vast majority of domesticated animals. And then a final argument that David made was that it's in the nature of the current political system and capitalism that even if we accorded the legal status of citizenship, we would be unable to enforce it. And he based that on the idea that in the case of people with intellectual disabilities, we failed. So what possible grounds would we have to think that we'd be able to effectively enforce protections for animals? So that's an interesting argument. We looked a lot at the disability literature. It plays an important role in our book. We would argue that there have in fact been dramatic improvements in the treatment of people with intellectual disabilities over the last 30 years. Yes, there are abuses, yes, there are scandals, but dramatic improvements, and improvements in part because they are seen as citizens, and they have mobilized as citizens. They haven't just mobilized as vulnerable, dependent people who can suffer. They've mobilized as members of the community who have been recognized by others as members of the community. And the fact that they've mobilized the language of citizenship, we think, has helped to ensure that there have been meaningful changes and that the same could apply for domesticated animals.
Thanks. Sherry has delegated to me the task as well. So I just want to talk about one thing that arose during Luis's talk, which is this, the empirical nature of the question of whether what you might think of as half measures or amelioration is either blocks or leads to abolition. So the sort of text on this right now is Gary's debate at the 2013 AR conference with Bruce Friedrich, in which they each, Bruce is, I take him at his word when he says that he is a vegan who seeks abolition as his end goal, but he thinks that welfareism is a path to get there. And as Luis says, there are principal reasons not to participate in that. There are reasons of time allocation. But I do agree that there is ultimately an empirical question there that might, for some people, make the difference. I just want to emphasize, this is I'm sort of excerpting the piece from the chapter that Sherry summarized, but that she didn't present. I want to emphasize the incredible complexity of that empirical question. Right? The empirical question is, over the long run, are efforts to regulate, modify, etc., the system in ways that are compromises within fall very far short of the ultimate goal, are they likely to get us there faster, or are they not? And I'll just give you, and I think the answer is, it depends, and it's almost impossible to know in advance. Let me just give you two examples. In the mid to late 19th century, a lot of German socialists opposed the program of democratic socialism because they thought it would co-opt what they really wanted to build, which was a real socialist system. And so they thought they were horrified by Bismarck's co-optation of the left's program. They were right; it did co-opt it. Give you another example coming out the other way. In the 1990s, there was a split within the LGBT rights movement over whether to support marriage equality, and then even over whether to support civil unions as a path to marriage equality, with some people arguing, number one, marriage is a heteronormative institution, it's going to impede LGBT rights in the long run, and even if that's your goal, this supposed way station is going to become the end point. That turned out to be wrong. That is to say, the movement for marriage equality, I think, has brought with it greater rights for LGBT Americans across the board. Would either of those have been confidently predicted in advance by, 1 to 100 university social science studies? I don't think so. I think these sorts of complicated empirical questions can only be answered in real time, and so you are left with falling back on what are your sort of principled reasons to decide where to allocate your time.
I'm a little embarrassed to say Anna has allocated her time to me as well, so we are seeing sexism in action. I think, on the issue of who's got the burden, I would say that is determined by what your starting principles are. So basically my position is we cannot morally justify using them, and I think the burden is on those people who want to pursue welfare regulation to explain why. Look, it's a zero-sum game. It's a zero-sum game. As Gary said, every minute of time, every ounce of energy, every cent of resources that you spend, talking to people about cage-free eggs or, organic milk or happy meat or any of that nonsense is time, energy, money that you don't spend talking to people about veganism. So it is a zero-sum game, and if your starting principle is it's morally wrong, then, somebody needs to show me why we should be doing otherwise. The empirical facts are, if you look at animal welfare regulation, what it does and what it has done over the past 200 years is make animal exploitation more economically efficient. Now, Luis raises the interesting question. What if, hypothetically, you had a situation where you had a welfare reform that really, really, made a significant impact, really significantly reduced suffering, really significantly reduced demand, really significantly raised prices, that sort of thing, that sort of welfare regulation that would go beyond efficient exploitation. The answer is, I ain't never seen such a thing, and I don't think it's even possible. I would still not support it because of my moral principles, but at least I would understand why other people supported it, but it's not something that has ever occurred before. Let me give you just a quick example. Rape is still a huge problem. I mean, it's not like a problem that we've solved. It's a huge problem. It's getting worse, and a lot of rapes are violent. But we don't have people saying, well, we could reduce the violence of rapes if we had humane rape campaigns. We don't think that way because our starting point is rape should not occur at all. It's a violation of fundamental rights. Similarly, if we're talking about a violation of fundamental rights with animals, the idea that we sit around saying, well, maybe what we should do is try to get people to go to Whole Foods and buy animal, that just strikes me as implausible. I agree with Michael. These empirical questions are very complex. The study, the Kansas State study that Luis pointed to call it a bad study would be an insult to bad studies. It's as far as I'm concerned, it is nothing more than propaganda from the meat industry. The fact that professors did it, is, in my judgment, irrelevant. I think methodologically, you don't have to have the sophistication of a mollusk. They may be sentient, but you don't. It's that you read the study. What they basically say is that animal consumption with respect to pigs and chickens has not gone up as much as we think as it should have gone if you predicted it, given the consumption patterns. And we think that may be because of animal welfare campaigns, because there were animal welfare campaigns going on. Well, there was also other things going on. There was also like rain. There was also, Santa Claus. It was Christmas. Lots of things happened. The idea that it's animal welfare campaigns that caused the reduction, the increase in pigs and chickens to be as slower than we thought. That just blows my mind that anybody, and I'm not saying Luis made the point that he's not saying it's a good study, but he's saying, does it shift the burden? Answer, not in my judgment. Final point, capitalism. Animals have been exploited in every single system. I hate capitalism. As a matter of fact, Sue Colb, Anna Charlton, and I wrote in 1991 an article called Why, do you even remember that? It was so long ago. That we wrote an article called Why the American Left Should Support Animal Rights. So look, I think capitalism sucks. I think it's terrible. I think it's a bad system. But the reality is animals have suffered under every single economic system, including tribal systems, it doesn't, if they're property, if they're things, which is a fundamental moral issue, then that's going to play out in every single system. And I think that there's a question that we have to ask ourselves is it capitalism that makes people bad or whatever, or is it a fundamental flaw, not something we can't overcome, but is it sort of who we are as beings that sort of, attract us to something as ugly as capitalism? Anyway, so that's that. All right, next person. My friend, Luis.
All right. I don't really have a lot to say. I'm too tired. I have to catch a plane soon. But Michael's point is well taken, and Gary seemed to agree with it that these are empirical claims, whether in the long run this will cause more suffering or not. Welfare reforms, and that they're almost impossible to figure out ex ante. If that's the case, then don't make them. Right? What's the point of making the empirical claim if you know from the outset that we won't be able to tell whether the empirical claim is true until it happens in real time, as Michael pointed out. So don't make them and then just default, right, fall back on your basic principles, which is what Michael, I think, is suggesting. And what Gary said, that if push comes to shove, he would do that. He would stand by the principle, which I don't. I think that's perfectly sensible for them to do. But Gary did say that if this hypothetical reform that I'm talking about, and note, I was always talking about this hypothetical reform. With regard to Prop 2, I said Gary may be right. I don't know if that's a good one. Probably it's not. But if this hypothetical reform exists that reduces animal suffering significantly under conditions that we can agree on, Gary did say that he would you said that you would not support it, because it would still, but you would respect.
I would understand
You
why
would
it was
understand
drafted.
it in a way that you don't understand current
Exactly.
animal welfare. But then Gary said, but you know, this is talking about angels or fairies because that regulation that Luis is talking about doesn't exist. I'm not convinced it doesn't exist. I think it may not exist because Gary is probably right that the animal welfare movement has been coupled with industry for so long. But I would be interested in seeing what happens if people like you, who don't behold yourself to the animal, to the animal industry, if people like you would think about that kind of regulation X without having to appeal to donors and what have you, whether you could come up with that welfare regulation. And I'm not sure it's impossible. Perhaps it is, but I'm not sure. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, two things briefly. I realized I didn't say anything about domestication, so you don't even know what it is. So, in essence, I think it was Cleveland Amory who said some time ago that if we want to look at our treatment of other animals, we should start with our language. And I think all forms of oppression, that language is it's a vital tool, to create, to devalue whoever it is that's being oppressed. So anyway, I've always disliked the term domestication because I was taught in school it was a benign partnership between humans and other animals, and both flourished. And then I came to realize, well, that's not true. And then there seems to be also this idea that once animals are domesticated, that they become frozen in this tightly dependent relationship with other animals, and there's no way out for them. And I don't think that's true either. About 10 years ago, 100 cows in Columbus, Ohio, the state fairgrounds, 100 cows escaped in the night. And it took them months. It took them months to find all of those cows, and some of them were very sophisticated, in keeping themselves out of sight. And I thought, if they can do that, imagine, what they could do if they had support. So anyway, when I look back at other animals, and I say, 10,000 years ago, they were captured, they were confined, they were exploited, and over time they were biologically manipulated, they were desecrated. So I thought, I'm going to use the word domestication to talk about what happened to other animals, as opposed to this, what I think is an ideologically latent term, domestication. And finally, to come back, Gary and I have this ongoing debate about capitalism. And I think this is the point. People hunted other animals under tribalism because it was a subsistence. They didn't really have a lot of alternatives in a lot of places. And you can say, well, what about socialists? Well, if you look at the Soviet Union, immediately after the revolution, they were attacked by armies, by a united army of Germany, United States, France, England, the White Army. They went in, they tried to take them out militarily. They couldn't do it. So then they launched the Cold War. And the Soviet Union was always under this threat of attack, and of course, it just destroyed, what that could have become. And if you look at Cuba, when Cuba had their revolution, the United States went after them immediately. They tried to assassinate Castro. They tried to invade with the Bay of Pigs, and they've had this harsh economic sanctions on Cuba, and they've been in survival mode for a long time. So my point is, if we had a socialist system in which we were not socially engineered, if we had a true democracy, those are the conditions by which we can end oppression of all sorts. So I think Gary is by taking this position, it's like saying, well, we don't really need to look at capitalism. I think that is, all right, well, Gary will correct me. But when he seems to suggest that it occurs in all systems, it seems to be saying, well, maybe we don't have to worry so much about capitalism as we're pursuing rights for other animals. And I think it's essential because capitalism has been at the core of animal oppression. It was the oppression of other animals that led to the growth and development of capitalism, and capitalism has been driving it ever since. And again, I think we need a real democracy if we're going to put an end to that. Thanks.
The individual people, and please try to keep your answers, because we're running out of time. Go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks to all the speakers. This is a great conference. So I have two questions or comments really. I'll be brief.
One.
Just one?
One question.
All right. So this is for Will and Sue. So I'm very excited and very sympathetic with the basic project. responsibility part is really not that problematic because we're linguistic animals. So this question that is this some particular means of contributing to the public good, consistent with the aggressors' interest in information. There's no ambiguity. We don't write talk like this, but it seems like we're always going to be kind of there's going to be a kind of inferential leap of faith, as it were, with non-human animals. Trying to work out whether something is consistent with their inclinations and interests sort of on their path. And as good vegans, this is going to be a leap of good faith, but it's sort of a leap all the same. So I wonder if you can get a lot of what you want to get as basic claims with something like lordship instead of citizenship. So you still get a lot of the sort of all the negative rights, a lot of the positive rights, pretty robust conception of political agency, but maybe without the kind of troublesome element in our sort of having to work on their behalf what is and isn't consistent with their inclinations.
We're going to collect questions.
No, go ahead, answer. I mean, if you can come to the mic, one or both of you want to come to the microphone because people can't hear. It's unfortunate. I wish that.
First of all, thanks for the question. It's a very important question. We are open, first of all, to other frameworks other than citizenship. But we are drawn to citizenship for a number of reasons. And the first thing I would want to say is that the problem that you identify of how can we be sure about this interpretation of the subjective good, and this is a crucial problem or a challenge, but I think we have to be willing to at least try to make that effort. So we don't want to give up on the idea that it's possible to for animals to indicate to us their subjective good and move immediately to a model where we make decisions about their good in objective terms. We think that would be the wrong order to proceed. We need to make the best effort we can in terms of what would it mean to interpret their subjective good. And so this is where we draw heavily on the literature about children's rights and disability, cognitive disability rights literature about what that process is for accessing the subjective good of people who are not linguistic agents. And I think there's a lot of material there to think about, a lot of processes that we can explore, and that should be our first step, is to see what can we do along those lines, being fully aware of the challenges of doing so.
Yes.
I have a question for Professor Steiner. I was just curious, I know you wrote on it briefly in Animals and Limits of Postmodernism, but I was wondering what your impression of the work of David Wood from Vanderbilt might be. He's a Derrida scholar, as you know, and so he's someone who comes at it from a very different perspective than you, but I feel like while your philosophical maybe perspective is distinct, your practical approach to the issue of non-human animals seems to be more in line.
Yeah, the one piece of David Wood's work that I comment on in Animals and Postmodernism is, if I remember my own work correctly, is an essay called Comment ne pas manger. And in that he says, some people say that Derrida, or actually what he says is this: Derrida did not take deconstruction to its logical conclusion, and that's the reason Derrida ends up making those kinds of statements that I quoted in my talk this morning. What I argue in the book is that, in fact, I think that Derrida really does take deconstruction to its logical conclusion. And when people like David Wood try to get something like veganism or vegetarianism out of deconstruction, it's a conjuring trick, and it has no basis in the sort of metaphysical and epistemological starting point that they come from. And I think that's just a fundamental limitation that Wood never was able to overcome.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so this question is for Will Kymlicka of Donaldson.
So we talked a lot about domesticated animals today, but I know that in your book you actually spend some time talking about wild animals. So in talking about domestication, could you comment on what would prevent people from wanting to domesticate wild animals? Because as you talk about, there's certain benefits that domesticated animals enjoy, and some people probably want to extend those benefits to wild animals. So is it that the status of domestication is not problematic, but the process by which you domesticate them is?
Well, so there are two different issues. One is that historically the process of domestication involved violence, involved the suppression of basic rights, it involved captivity and the violation of bodily integrity and so on. One could imagine a future possibility by which a wild animal could come to trust and come to want to be a companion of humans that would not involve some of those direct violations and so would not be intrinsically objectionable on that grounds. But it's part of our story that citizenship, the rights of domesticated animals are not solely the responsibility of an individual caretaker. If we are to provide justice for domesticated animals, we have to change the way we structure public space, we have to change the way we structure our public institutions, including healthcare and political representation and so on. And so I don't think it should be, and that has implications for all of us. And so I don't think it should be left to the unilateral choice of an individual human to bring a wild animal into the community, even if they do that in a way that doesn't involve violence. Because it creates obligations for all of us, and these are going to be onerous obligations about restructuring public space, restructuring public institutions, and so my inclination is to say that there should actually be. It's not just a problem of process. There are ethical questions about how one person who wants to bring a wild animal into, for perfectly legitimate and understandable reasons, wants to have a stronger bond with a wild animal. The fact is, to provide justice for that individual animal has implications for not just for that individual caretaker, but for society as a whole. And so we would have to have some very clear rules, and I think also very clear limits about how that would take place.
Dorf?
My question is for Dr. Nyberg. You are a kindred spirit. I started as a socialist activist in my very young youth. And you were absolutely right. Animals, you bring up animal rights and they're like, no. I was hoping to come out of this event with a more narrow thesis topic, but it actually got bigger. Well, my question for you, and one of the reasons that I've drifted away from the whole socialist movement, was not only the animals question and the women question, but because and I'm hoping you can give me some hope on this. In my research for my thesis, what I keep coming back to is that the dividing line is empathy versus non-empathy. And that and forgive the analogy, but the chicken and the egg, I don't know which came first. All of the systems of domination and oppression, including those that predate capitalism. Is it people lacking empathy that bring those systems about, or is it the system itself that creates people lacking empathy? And it seems to me that capitalism promotes lack of empathy. But it also seems to me that people without empathy will be willing to do things that you and I aren't willing to do, and therefore they will gravitate towards positions of power, and therefore be in control. For example, corporate heads in government, political, is right for sociopaths. So my question to you is, how do you, and if you've seen a book called The Empathic Civilization, I can't remember the author. I'm sorry? Rifkin, thank you. Jeremy Rifkin. It's a fabulous book, and he says in the beginning that he does not discuss animals because it's a bigger topic, but everything that he says the animals should be incorporated. And he's calling for a more empathic civilization. So I'm wondering how you see a socialist revolution terms of it coming back, you know, full circle again, like Stalin was a sociopath, you know, coming full circle back again because non-aesthetic people will do things that you and I won't do and we just won't care.
So did everyone hear that? Any help? I guess, you know, the short answer is, you know, that as a sociologist, any other sociologist here? Yeah, so tell me if you would concur. But I think sociologists generally agree that our reality is socially constructed. So if you create a society that is generally loving and nurturing, there's a lot of empathy, then, you know, your modal personality type is going to be a person who's going to be expressing empathy and love. I guess, you know, to go back, so I guess I'm suggesting if we could transcend capitalism, get to that type of system, you know, we could begin fostering that. So what happened in the Soviet Union, again, I think Stalin came into prominence in all this disaster happened because they were under attack, you know, from global capitalism. And they went into this kind of like the United States at 9/11, and, you know, everybody's on the defensive, and we come up with all this, you know, cutting back of rights, and NSA grows, and all of this happens. So I think in the Soviet Union, you know, we just saw them going into this defensive mode. So again, we don't know what could have happened if they had been allowed. Same thing with Cuba.
I completely agree. I used them just because I didn't want to, I wanted to make note of what Gary F. said about other societies exploiting animals too. I mean, you know, Bush was a sociopath. What I'm saying is that these people exist no matter what. So how do you transcend it when they exist and they will be willing to do things that most of us won't do?
I think you do that with true democracy. If you have a true democracy, then I think those people, you know, won't, you know, come in to hold power. You know, if we have real mass media where there's full disclosure and everyone knows what's going on, we know what people's positions are, we know if they're representing the public. If we had democratic mass media, you know, everyone would know Gary's Francine's name and they would know his ideas. So I guess I think in a true democratic society, I think, you know, we can protect ourselves. But I think the question of how do we get there, you know, that's the big question. Of course, one thing to keep in mind is that Bernie Sanders is considering a run for the presidency. Now, Bernie Sanders, you know, is this, you know, old socialist, you know, from Vermont, and he's in the United States Senate, you know, and he's an independent, but he's thinking about running for president. So my friends and family, some of them will say, but what if it's Hillary Clinton running against Jeb Bush or somebody like that? You know, you're going to have to vote, you know, for the lesser of the evil. Now, we've been voting for the lesser of the evil time after time after time, and look where we are, right? We thought we were going to get hope and change, and we got, you know, a Wall Street economy. We got massive deportations. We got people being assassinated from the sky. So it occurred to me that by voting for the lesser of the evils is like a form of political welfare first. You know, it's like the same, we're just going down the same road, and it just perpetuates, you know, this hegemonic control. So again, I think one of the things that we can do is, you know, maybe encourage Bernie Sanders to run and then support him, and then after that, then to try to keep that movement together and generate, you know, energy then for the next run. But yeah, that's an initial idea.
Thank you.
Yes.
I had a question for Michael and Shelley. Is that
Sherry.
Sorry, I apologize. I tried. I'll admit that I haven't read the book, Questions That People Ask Vegans, so you may have addressed it there. But I thought the parallels between the pro-life movement and the non-human animal rights movement were really fascinating. But I actually had a question. So it's in a lot of interchanges I have with people about veganism, it seems they want to bring up the pro-life question and also often the religious background question. I'm an atheist myself, and I feel a need to be honest about my views on these matters, but I feel like they're using it as sort of a gotcha question, like, oh, you don't believe in my particular religious opinion, or you're pro-choice, and therefore I disagree with your views as a whole. And I'm wondering, how do you talk to people in that situation where you can illuminate why they should take veganism seriously despite your disagreements in these other ways?
Okay, great question. I actually have a chapter in mind if I ordered a cheeseburger about each of those issues.
Oh, great.
One is, are you against abortion? And it's structured as 13 questions that people routinely pose to vegans. And so each chapter is a question. Like, well, why not just be vegetarian? Or these two. So one is why, so are you against abortion? And I have a discussion that I can't really boil down in that short space, but basically I talk about some of the differences between requiring someone to carry a pregnancy to term on the one hand and asking someone not to violate another animal on the other, and that there are distinctions even though there are parallels as well. So I think you don't need, I mean, you can say, you know, I'm pro-choice, or you can say, well, you know, you can be both I conclude in that particular chapter that I think that the abortion question is actually a difficult question in some ways. I don't think the vegan question is a difficult one. And so that's what distinguishes them, but that one could be either pro-choice or anti-abortion and simultaneously be vegan. On the religion question, it's a really good question, because someone says, well, God doesn't want us to be, he wants us to eat animals or whatever. And you know, it's sort of an interesting thing to me, because I'm not especially a religious person, I'm not a particularly religious person, but it seems to me that if one were, that it would seem to be arrogant to, you know, presume to know what God wants.
Well, yeah.
But in any event, but what I do, because I was raised as a religious Jew, is I talk about one feature of Judaism, which is the prohibition against eating dairy and meat together. And what I say is that this entire prohibition is derived from a sentence that appears 3 times in the Bible that says, do not seethe a kid, meaning a baby goat, in his mother's milk. That's the statement in there, and it appears 3 times. And so what I suggest is that if you look at this sentence, it seems to me the most obvious lesson has to do with the relationship between a mother and a baby animal, and rather than what you eat together at a particular meal. And so so I think that just logically looking at that, it's a sentence that it's certainly not abolitionist, but it gestures in that direction far more than anything that is currently observed. And there are religious people who are vegan as well. I mean, there are a group of people who are, you know, ultra-Orthodox, who say that given what happens to animals, no dairy is kosher. You know, so I have a friend who says dairy, it's, you know, veganism, it's the new kosher. So I think there are ways of talking to people who don't share the same outlook by just demonstrating that, you know, even where you're coming from. And I think that, you know, the gotcha thing, absolutely. People ask questions because they just want to get you. And some days you're going to be in a bad mood and you're just going to say, go to hell. And, you know, I get that, you know, and it's like there was there's actually this T-shirt I saw on the web, and I hope it's okay to swear.
I don't care.
Okay. A T-shirt on the web, and it says, I'm vegan because fuck you. And, you know, it's obviously not my go-to approach to vegan advocacy, but, you know, there are days when one feels like saying that. But other days, most days, hopefully, you can engage even with the gotcha question by just saying, you know, by just identifying the kernel of reason and empathy in their question, and just saying, you know, I'm so glad you asked me a question about this, and you can get into real conversation. So.
Thank you.
We do something similar in Eat Like You Care, but the bottom line, you know, somebody starts giving you the Judeo-Christian thing, point them to Genesis. First book of Genesis. In the beginning, God creates the world and says, the herb and the seed shall be your food. Everybody's a vegan in the beginning. It's only when the covenant is ruptured, humans are driven from the Garden of Eden as a result, by the way, of a conspiracy between a woman and a snake. And they're driven from Eden. Then eating animals becomes an accommodation to the fallen state. So, you know, my response is, if that's your thing, then you need to think really seriously, because it looks to me like the Old Testament points, and you know, when the covenant is restored, the lion shall lay down with the lamb, and none shall be killed in all of my holy kingdom. And so, you know, it gets back to that. So if that's your thing, then my view is to sort of say, look, you know, if you really believe God, you know, says go, I want you to eat at McDonald's, you've got an impoverished perception of God. Okay, yes, you in back.
Just a follow-up to your statement, because I'm a vegan, so there's no real gotcha question that I could put to you, but I do.
Who are you directing this to?
Huh?
Who are you directing?
Sorry?
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But I do think that being a vegan and being pro-abortion is being hypocritical. And I present my own opinions as to why that is, even though I'm not pro-life. I'm not considered pro-lifer. Just based on certain ideas that I have, and then you have your ideas. So my question is there anything that you think that will ever come along with a lot of what we've discussed today, because a lot of it is our own theories, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think there's anything that's going to come along that's going to transcend my belief versus your belief, my data versus your data, where we can have some type of consensus or meeting place? Because that's my concern as a behavioralist. It's a war of wills and a war of beliefs, and this is moral, this is not moral. I mean, we see this in religion all the time, and we create more fractions. So do you think there's anything that's going to come along that's going to transcend that debate?
Okay, so this is not just about abortion or about just
No,
general.
just using the example you the person gave.
I don't think there's a universal approach to to getting to yes. I think that in terms of an argument that you'll make, and every time you make that argument, people are going to say, oh yeah, and then they'll join your troop. It'd be nice if it worked that way, although I would worry that it would work that way for somebody who's on the other side of my issues. But I think the key is really for people to listen to each other when they're making their claims and making their arguments. So obviously, if someone says to me, I think it's morally wrong to do this, and I say, well, I think it's morally right to do that, and we just keep repeating our respective positions, that's not really a debate at all. That's just restating what you think. So I think it's useful to ask a person something that someone once said that I thought was really interesting about. She said she was talking to a hunter, and that she just assumed initially that a hunter is really going to have nothing, there's not going to be a useful conversation. But she said that the hunter, as she said, it must be really hard. It must have been really hard when you started doing this. And he said, yeah. And he actually just got very moved as he was remembering back to when he began killing animals, and he hadn't yet numbed himself. And she showed an interest in what that was like. Now, I don't have the ending of, and then that evening they went to a vegan restaurant and vegan, I wish, maybe it happened. But I think that it's useful to try to enter that person's world, and it can be very difficult to do that when somebody disagrees with you and is rude and potentially just not really reachable, or doesn't seem to be. But sometimes people really surprise you. They come at you and they seem really obnoxious. And you just say, it sounds like you've had a really bad experience with a vegan at some point. You want to tell me about that? And they do, and you talk. And then a year later, they come back and say, I thought about what you said that time, and I've moved on this issue. And you thought it was over. So yeah. So I think empathy, coming back to the earlier comment about empathy, that can really be a good way of persuading people beyond just saying, okay, well, I have the killer argument, because I don't think the killer argument is usually sufficient.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, Anne.
I have a question for Gary and Anna about, I know you like grassroots vegan activism, and I just wonder if you have a few pieces of advice, including what pitfalls to avoid for those of us who want to be vegan activists or advocates.
Well, I think we're seeing more and more the power of people talking to their acquaintances and family in their own communities. I don't think social movements ever get going in a successful way by pronouncements being made, and then we expect the word to get out in some non-immediate way. I certainly don't think that corporate charities are going to have an impact. I think they develop very quickly their own interests, their own territorial concerns, and they work out their own conflicts in a way that hasn't got to do too much with the original message that they were formed to put out. I am still optimistic about the power of the individual
feeling, speaking from a considered, informed, good faith position, to have sway in their own communities. I think we need a very informed citizenry in the human sphere, and I think we need to give ourselves a healthy kick to do that work, to get to the point where we can express ourselves clearly, confidently, and where we've done our own thinking. And we're not encouraged to do that. We're not encouraged to do that by the media. We're not encouraged by a movement, and I hate that word, that says, send me your $15 and we'll do the job for you. No, we have to do it. I've said before, revolutions are not funded by charitable organizations. It's never happened, and it won't happen now. It won't be permitted. But with all the downside of this oppressive, grinding impact of capitalism, which is so depressing because you think, how on ever are we ever going to change that for humans or animals? One thing capitalism does, at some level, it puts up a fight. It does respond to the consumer in some ways. So we have consumer choices that can make an impact. If you want beans, they'll grow them for you. If you say, I don't want steak anymore, I was going to say asparagus, but that's not good in terms of the environment. But if you want spinach, they'll grow it for you. They may fight for a bit because they've got mechanisms and future contracts and all that sort of stuff on cattle, but time, you can change that around. And at a time when I'm feeling it's harder and harder to have a voice as a citizen, to have impact in the political system, and to do anything to turn this ship of state around, we do have some impact. So we should go and do it. A vegan education, I think, is refreshing and incredibly powerful.
And I agree with that completely, and one thing we've got to get away from is this idea that we need leaders, you know? Everybody's got to be a leader, you know? Like, this is not like just somebody's, it's all of our responsibility. It's our collective responsibility, and we've all got to do it. We've got to stop this idea that we look to people to, I mean, I get tons of with this Facebook, the Facebook site has gone crazy. I mean, it's like, I've got like 40,000 people in the past year. Obviously, this is an idea that is attractive to a lot of people. And people say, would you please start an organization? I say, you just don't get it. The last thing in the world, I would rather be dead than start, the revolution will not be tax deductible. And I have no desire to start an organization. What I want you to do is educate yourself and talk to everybody you can, and you and everybody, And one of the things that I think is problematic is that it's easy to look to leaders because then you don't have the responsibility to educate yourself. And so, I mean, when you write something and somebody says, well, gee, can you do it as a podcast? Because I don't have time to read. And the answer is, yeah, you got time to read. You got time to read. I can't explain why Western civilization is wrong in a tweet. Sorry. You're gonna have to read something. You're gonna have to educate yourself. And it doesn't mean you have to have a graduate degree in philosophy, but it does mean that you've got to learn. It's like one of the reasons why we wrote Eat Like You Care, one of the reasons why Sherry wrote her book. Was like, I'm sure that the motivations were exactly the same. How do you present, how do you present these ideas in ways where people can sort of get them, grab them, hold them, and then deal, the next time they're at a cocktail party and somebody says, what about plants? And you don't like stick your fork in their eye. You have a discussion about, about why plants aren't sentient, or, somebody comes up and asks you about abortion. I get that all the time, and I always say, look, I'll agree. I don't think fetuses in the first trimester are sentient, but I do think it's a moral issue. But the bottom line is, let's assume the fetus is sentient. Let's assume it's a right holder. Let's assume it's a person. The bottom line is, you got one person living inside the body of another person, a situation which doesn't replicate anywhere else in nature. The only question becomes, who resolves the conflict? The woman in whose body the other right holder exists, or a white male legislator who's never going to get pregnant? And so, in a patriarchal society, who resolves that? I don't like abortion, but you know what? I've never met a woman or a radical feminist who does like abortion. The only question is, who resolves the problem in a patriarchal society? So, there are answers to these questions. And, but one thing I got to tell you, people get frustrated really quickly. And, if you're going to be a good educator, you got to, every time somebody asks you the plant question, somebody says, oh, cats can eat. You have to act as though it's the first time you've ever heard that question. And you've got to be totally focused and engage that person, because if you basically, I understand Sherry's view, sometimes you want to just say screw you if you're in a bad mood. But we really got to understand, this is a real puzzle. I mean, and the crazier the question, the person says, if somebody comes up to you and says, but Hitler was a vegetarian, you know that the person is struggling and has nothing better to say except an idiotic thing. And so this is a person who's troubled. So always look for always realize that everybody you meet is an invitation. Everybody you meet has that spark. Your challenge is to ignite it, and that's what it is,
Gary, can I?
Yeah, sure.
So a pitch for it's called a book. It's really like 40 pages of large type, but it's fantastic by Jim Corcoran and Ray Sikora, called Plant Peace Daily, and they have like 100 tips on things you can do. I mean, very practical things like, wear a message shirt, assuming you're not going to court or something. Or, if you're going to table, don't be eating on the table, unless it's like really good food that you have free samples or something. I mean, and it's like stuff at that level about how to be an effective advocate.
Also, getting people, preparing vegan food, like, having tables where you so that people don't think that vegans eat styrofoam. And, that's also a useful thing to do. We have, on the Abolition Sports website, we have a pamphlet that Anna and I wrote that is now in 21 different languages. You can print it out, it's free, nothing costs any money. You press a button, it comes out, and you distribute it, Anyway. Oh, wait, Jason, in the back.
I guess my question goes towards you, Professor Francino, Professor Nyberg, and Professor Charlton. You all talked a little bit about the whole socialism versus capitalism, how that can have effect on sort of what type of how quickly abolitionism could come into play. And I don't know, I see the issue as more of an education issue than anything. I mean, it kind of seems to be repeated in what you're all saying. It's like there seems to be more of an issue that people don't have access or the ability to get these ideas and to receive these thoughts. And I don't know, it's always in my opinion that if you have a properly educated populace, or a populace that at least has access to quality education or equal education, that knows how to make arguments, like logical arguments, and to hear arguments where they can actually critically think about them, that you would have the ability, regardless of what kind of political, socioeconomic system you have set in place, or what kind of formation you have, they would be able to come to a fair a solution that does kind of represent empathy towards other creatures or other human beings. And so my question is that you agree that education is kind of more the root of the problem than maybe the socioeconomic issue is, or the socioeconomic structure is, or do you really think that capitalism would have to be kind of done away with also, in addition to that, regardless of what type of educational system you have set in place?
Yeah, I guess, that educational system that you're describing, it sounds great. I just don't.
Yeah, it's not exactly feasible.
Yeah, so I guess, I just, not under capitalism, I think, when the capitalists do social engineering, they've had education for a long time. And in my son's school, most of the classes, there's a board of education, and the board of education that tends to represent, business people in the business community disproportionately, end up, pointing to, selecting, endorsing textbooks. And in my son's school, they had videotapes from the American Cattlemen's Association, the National Dairy Council coming in their life skills course. So I think in order to have, again, true public education, and the mass media would have to be behind it. Again, I don't see that happening, especially as capitalism is going into this crisis stage globally, and look at the lengths they're going to, to keep accumulating profit. And I don't see us turning back toward anything that's more democratic. And the other part is that as the economic system melts down, people will start doing all kinds of things to try to make a living. From going out and killing elephants to raising chickens in their backyard, sell them.
I mean, they'll look for other animals as a way to sustain themselves. So I guess I don't see anything truly transformative happening in this system.
I agree with David, but I would also say, Jason, the ability of people to think clearly and to understand arguments. I mean, most people think arguments are things that where you raise your voice and yell at each other, and you know, they don't understand premises and conclusions and the relationship between. I mean, so I do think that there's a problem, and I think that we need to teach people to think more critically. And you know, we have the internet now, which in many ways cuts down the opportunity costs of getting information and of connecting with each other, and the amount of crap. You know, I mean, you would think that it would have increased critical thinking, and it hasn't. It's decreased critical thinking. And so, you know, but I agree. I mean, I think David's right that, you know, the socioeconomic system is gonna focus, you know, is gonna shape things in various ways. But that sort of engineering with a population that's unable to think its way out of a paper bag is a prescription for disaster. And we do need to get back to, you know, we do need to relearn, you know, reasoning skills. As a matter of fact, I used to teach a course in basic logic here years ago, and I'm actually starting to think, I'm thinking that maybe I'll start teaching it again because it wouldn't be a bad thing for law students to learn. Corey from Temple University.
Oh, nice intro.
Hey, you know, I remember, for a guy my age, I got to put, okay, go ahead.
I hosted a talk recently that you gave, so I'm impressed. Yeah. So I only thought of this because of this vegan advocacy question. Kristen and I were both in Philadelphia. We do vegan advocacy and participate in vegan pledge campaign. We also just advocate veganism among our friends and social networks, and we're very effective at it. But I also do single issue campaigns, and I know this is something you've criticized. So for example, I participate in campaigns that, you know, attempt to rid the circus from the city of Philadelphia. I also participate in like immigrant rights campaigns. And part of the reason why I do like the circus campaigns is because I see them as being effective at bringing a presence to animal rights. And I also see it as like a political opportunity to communicate a language of liberation. So I'm wondering if, are you zero tolerance single campaign, or do you see any usefulness at all? Like when I do the immigrant rights campaigns, I tend not to talk about veganism. But at the same time, I'm also talking about liberation. I'm talking about rights in a sense that transcends human rights.
Yeah, but look, I mean, it's not that, as I said, you know, when I wrote Rain Without Thunder, I basically said single issue campaigns are problematic because they tend to sort of get people to think that there are certain forms of exploitation that are better than other forms of exploitation, and I think that's a problem. It's different when you're talking about human rights. If you're going after, you know, genocide in you know, Darfur, nobody thinks that you think genocide in other places are okay, you know, is okay. But when you go after, for example, meat, and you say, you know, meatless Monday, which I think is like absurd. You know, you're giving people the idea that dairy products are somehow less problematic, or eggs are less problematic than meat, which I think is nonsense. You know, the law. I've been doing this for 35 years now, and when I first got involved with this, the big issue was fur, fur. Fur industry is strong. It's been going on. You know, how many millions of dollars and how many groups have made zillions of bucks with anti-fur campaigns? And the fur industry is stronger than it's ever been. There is no distinction, morally coherent distinction, between fur and leather and wool. They're all the same. The only reason we have a fur campaign because it's a sexist society, and it gives people yet another reason to go up to women on the street that they don't know and call them names and engage in misogynistic behavior. And we don't do that with guys wearing leather coats because we don't want to lose our teeth. So I mean, I think that these campaigns, you know, these single issue campaigns, the problem with them is they don't help clear thinking. It's like, you know, I'll just tell you a quick story. I was once giving, and it was actually in Pennsylvania many years ago, I was giving a talk at a rally to stop hunting, you know, to stop a particular hunt. And there were some people there from you know, the news media, and the woman said, you have a secret agenda, don't you? And I said, no. And she said, you're against all meat eating. I said, no, actually, that's not true. I'm against all animal product eating. And she said, so it's not just this hunting. And I said, no, it's not just the hunting. And all the animal people who were there got really angry with me and said, just focus on the hunting. And I said, no, because there is no, I mean, you know, you focus on hunting, And anybody with a brain says, well, you know, what's the difference between going, you know, I mean, people aren't stupid, man. You know, we've got to get away from this idea that people are morons, that people can't understand simple messages, and that we're gonna overwhelm them if we have a discussion about veganism. We've got to get away from that. That's elitist thinking. People are, you know, people can get this. People can grasp this. And you know, we just got to get away from this idea that the only way we can sort of introduce it to them gradually is by saying, oh, let's talk about animals and circuses. You know, let's get wild animals out of circuses. Let's leave the other animals in this. I mean, and it just conveys the wrong idea. And I've never seen a single issue campaign that says, we're going after this, but it's really clear this is just one brick we're taking out of the wall, and we really want everybody to go vegan, and this is just the first step. That's a single issue campaign, at least I'd have fewer problems with, but you know what? I ain't never seen one in 35 years like that. Never. Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. Listen, we got to end. Thank you so much.
Suffering matters to everybody, and you don't have to focus on killing. You say, look, I want to talk to you. Like, you saw these conditions. I'm showing you here in the city slip number, and I know you don't want this. I know you.